In the previous video, we read what globalization is all about and how it has impacted the third world countries, inducing poverty and farmer suicides, along with a host of other problems to cripple the economy in every way. Let's read further. The foregoing elements of SAP are not recipes for removing centralized control over agriculture, but concentrating it now even further in the hands of agribusiness TNCs such as Monsanto, Cargill, PepsiCo, etc., who are emerging as the new zamindars. The structural impact of these changes are intrinsic to the package of trade liberalization. Under the globalization, privatization, and liberalization agenda of the World Bank, World Trade Organization, and International Monetary Fund, trade is more unfair than free. Ultimately, it is the poorer sections in every society that are the end losers. Over the years, there has been an increasing asymmetry between world prices and domestic prices. Index numbers of wholesale prices and consumer prices in India for almost all commodities have increased by over 2 times between 1990-91 and 1997-98. Over the same period of time, world commodity prices have been on the decline. With the removal of import restrictions, low commodity prices supported by high subsidies are destroying domestic production and livelihoods of the poor. While the incomes of the poor go down, their expenditure is rising due to rising consumer prices. Throughout the late 20th and the early 21st century, the term globalization has been frequently used in contemporary academic and general discourse, as well as at the forefront of international economic debate. This is because the process of globalization itself is mainly driven and engineered by corporate elites as well as the so-called transnational companies, that is TNCs. This constitutes the idea that globalization is fueled by profit-making activities and serving business ends, having been underpinned by the ideology of neoliberalism and market-driven. Globalization is therefore devoid of any normative principle of justice and humanity. In aiming for the profit maximization, social and human rights responsibilities have sometimes been abandoned and sidelined. As consequences of this phenomena, growing threats and violations of human rights have occurred, such as the inequality in economic growth, poverty, violations of fundamental human rights, and attack to states' sovereignty. Considering the negative impacts of globalization, there have been mounting concerns and calls for a mechanism to manage a globalization, as it is a process that cannot be stopped. Regardless of its multifaceted character, globalization has been dominantly associated with economic context, which connotes recent evolution in the nature of the global economy, reflected in the rapid development in the level and speed of economic transactions, primarily across geographical boundaries and territorial borders. This evolution has been brought about by a range of factors, among which include mainly advancement in technology and liberalization. Indeed, too much has been made of the phenomena of the globalization in its economic dimensions. It is worth noting that economic globalization and the emergence of TNCs tend to have significant impacts on human rights. The claims of anticipated growth, or at least the alleviation of poverty and increase in prosperity, always been propagated by its proponents, simply has not happened for the vast majority of world's population. It is like having a big cake, but its pieces are not equally shared for all, but dominated by certain powerful people. This was what already happened when the rich is getting richer and the poor became much poorer. Of course, to some extent, while profit maximization has become the core business of the TNCs, human rights are no longer relevant. Statistics show that this gap is widening both within and between nations, and that in many countries, poverty is both increasing by numbers and by depth. The weakness of international rules, bad policies, and weak governance in developing countries, and corporate practices which prioritize short term profit over long term human development are undermining the capacity of poor countries and poor people to benefit from international trade. In many cases, economic liberalization has been accompanied by greater inequality, and people are left trapped in utter poverty. The Human Development Report of 1997 revealed that poor countries and poor people too often find their interests neglected as a result of globalization. This growing gap between domestic consumer prices and international commodity prices refutes the claims of the free trade propagandists that the gains from unrestricted trade shall percolate down to consumers in the form of lower prices and high quality. Corporations gain by low commodity prices, peoples lose with rising costs of essential commodities, that the asymmetric response of domestic commodity prices to world prices is caused by the behavior of international trading companies and is not the result of trade restrictions or bidding processing costs is shown by Morissette 1999. This has cost the commodity exporting countries over US dollars 100 billion a year by limiting the expansion of the final demand for these products in the major consumer markets. The challenges in developing economy are many, especially in context of the monetary policy, the inflation and price stability phenomena. A good environment of stability happens to create saving mobilization and a sustained economic growth. The evolution of commodity prices has been one of the major sources of concern for policymakers from emerging countries to developed markets around the world. Commodity prices have a great influence on the dynamics of economic activity. Their international trade represents one quarter of the world's merchandise exchange, and a large share of developing world's GDP comes from commodity related activities. On the supply side, many developing countries are highly dependent on commodity exports income, and on the demand side, commodity markets play an important role as they transmit shocks from the world economic cycle to inflation in most economies. Unlike manufactured goods, primary products have flexible prices which respond very quickly to macroeconomic fundamentals and their international finance concepts. Thus, while consumers in India are paying more for their sustenance at the macro level, the country is getting less for what it exports, particularly in the face of a sharply declining currency value. The non fuel commodity price index declined by 45% in constant prices between 1980 and 1998. At the same time, the manufacturer's unit value index 1 rose by 44% over the same period of time. The adverse terms of trade is increasingly reflected in India's worsening trade deficit, which rose from 10,635 crores in 1990 to 91 to 34,495 crores in 1998-99. She gives a statistical data to support her point that the country is paying a huge cost, but the returns are negligible or rather negative, not something to look forward to in globalization. The polarization in domestic consumer prices and world prices and the surge in imports with the removal of quantitative restrictions implies that consumers in India end up paying more than they would had there been no trade. The choices of both farmers and consumers decrease as global corporations increase their control over food and agriculture. The case of wheat makes this polarization evident. Farmers in India earned only 650 to 700 rupees per quintal. However, global prices increased from $170 to $270 ton as a result of India importing 5.5 million tons, and domestic prices of wheat for consumers have increased to 1100 rupees per quintal. This increase is not due to scarcity but due to the growing corporate control over both the domestic market and international trade. The direct effect of globalization is intensified interdependence of Indian economy and world economy. As a result, it has become very difficult for government of India to insulate its economy from world economy. The government is no more the sole driver of Indian economy, which is influenced more and more by international policies and international economic conditions. Direction and depth of all economic activities in India is now governed largely by global economy. We may call globalization as a double-edged weapon who helped Indian consumers to enjoy all high quality global brands. On the other hand, it helped government of India to tide over its serious foreign exchange problem. Even it has been at the cost of decontrol of Indian government over its economy at the cost of local industry. Globalization is not only useless but dangerous too for Indian economy. It gave temporary relief to Indian government to tide over its serious foreign exchange situation during 1990-91 by enabling it to get loan from the World Bank. But as a byproduct, it has caused some permanent damage to Indian economic system. The expansion of capital and concentration of wealth in the hands of few is leading to expansion and growth of poverty on a large scale. The growing poverty and shrinking of purchasing power puts economies under stress. The ongoing economic crisis, which has lasted for a decade and is still going on, is the telling proof of this observation.